Hey everyone, welcome to the Conservation Made Simple podcast. This is Cameron.
And this is Logan.
And today we're actually going to be doing a wildfire podcast. It's all about wildfires. We originally had a scheduled post about the one-time use items, and that was kind of spurred on by saying we wanted to do something with the current state of our world and how I was noticing that we were seeing trash on the side of the road from masks and gloves. And I said, you know what? Let's push that and actually go even more into today's world of talking about wildfires. So we rescheduled, we planned this. And because we rescheduled, we were like, we're not going to have time to film this before our quote unquote due date. And said, all right, you know what? We'll just do this on Instagram Live. So
why not?
If you're listening to this on a podcasting platform, you can rewatch it on our Instagram. If you're hearing this following statement of not being able to watch it, that means it glitched out. But we are hopefully going to have that episode there. And otherwise, today we're going to be talking about kind of the background. What does a natural forest fire look like? What is it supposed to do without human interference really that much? I'll be talking about that. Then Logan's going to be going into how did it shift from a natural forest fire system to this now almost entirely man-made influenced wildfire. And then including in that will be some of the factors, climate policies. I'll let Logan be the one to talk about those. And then I'm going into today, 2020. Why does it seem so insane? Why did, and a little bit into 2019, we're talking about Australian wildfires. Why did it seem like just the world was on fire? What did we do? What went wrong? And then what's the current impact of that? So what is that doing to everything around us? And then from there, what's next? Logan will be going into what's next of the future. So that one is going to be heavy hitting, but we're going to tie it all in with what can we do as, the average American or average citizen wherever you are. So we'll get right into it. I'm going to go into the background. I wanted to first start with this. There's a caveat, or not a caveat. There's a assumed fear that wildfires across the board are just terrible. They're bad. It kills everything in its path. Now, I know that we've talked about it a little bit, that's not true.
Yep.
There are many species of both plants and animals that actually thrive off of wildfires. When we actually had our research with Bryant, when we were going over to the Olympic National Forest, he had taken a couple pictures of some squirrels that were even incorporating the burnt area of the Olympics. And it was kind of cool to see it in real time under our own research, not even just this hypothetical, the animals are like thriving and stuff. But there are some animals that need it for germination to be able to get their seeds from one place to another. Many beetles and types of bugs love to go to the dead trees. So they go straight to it as soon as it's burned. And then after that comes the birds, which then adds, it just goes up the pyramid there. Ultimately, the point that we wanted to say is that forests have all burned and they'll all burn again. It's just this continuous cycle that seems vicious, but it's really a systematic way to flush out some of the diseases. It flushes out some invasive species. It allows for things that haven't evolved to be in that area to get out. And plants and animals, like I said, those that have been in those areas have survived or have evolved to survive in those areas. And that may be going underground, running away. I was laughing. We were talking about how it seems terrible, but it only seems terrible to people because plants and animals, I guess plants, they can't move, but animals, like a bear, if he's threatened by the fire, all he's doing is running 18 miles down this direction and then restarts life. Whereas here we've become these insane pack rats that said, oh my gosh, there goes my house. What do I do now? And it's an interesting concept when you think about nature doesn't do that way. So animals are surviving. The fire makes a great home. And then what's really interesting that I don't think we talk about is that not only is it good, or not only is it like there's benefits within the fire, forests need the fire to actually survive.
They do.
So it's something that by us stepping in, there is a potential for it to be problematic. But young forests are able to come back faster. There are many plants that are the undergrowth that are not able to compete with other species that need them to be cleared out by fire. And gosh, I don't know where I was going with that statement. But backtrack that one. Forests need fire. And ultimately, when we look at it, burn trees, and we're like, oh my gosh, this thing is dead. It's kind of when we look at dead logs in our backyard and you go, yeah, there's nothing in there. But if anyone knows, if you were like me as a kid and just like was going through all of the rubble of the dead log, you get to see all these different grubs and stuff, thinking Hakuna Matata, right? But ultimately, the green trees are not the only ones that are healthy and feeding an ecosystem as well. The burnt ones are. So fires have also been something that have shaped most of the world. A great example of it is in the Miocene era, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
I think you are.
Eastern Eurasia. They had shaped the grasslands in terms of how the fire was able to push the seeds to different areas and also kind of blocked off where that grass was able to expand. So it's interesting to think that the world that we're looking around today was actually born out of fire, which I'm sure is in 90 million songs. But that is kind of how that really works in the real world. And then I had this quote from John Muir, because I think John Muir is a perfect person to put into the role of what was the old system and how did it work. He says that nature's ever at work, building and pulling down, creating and destroying, keeping everything whirling and flowing, allowing no rest but in rhythmic motion, chasing everything in endless song out of one beauty form into another. So it's this idea that the fire seems destructive, but it's really just creating the next step. And then there was another quote from H.H. Biswell. He's a professor of forestry. And I'm just going to read the quote straight up. First, he says that John Muir in 1894, everyone goes to John Muir. In 1894, he referred to fire as the master controller of the distribution of trees. Then Jepson in 1921, an early botanist at the University of California, concluded that the Sierra Nevada forests were clearly the result of periodic or irregular fires occurring over thousands of years. Kotak in 1930, a culturist and for many years director of the California Forest and Range Experiment Station, stated that in many regions, fire was the major force that molded and shaped the character of the forest. More recently, Reynolds, in 1959, a geographer and naturalist, suggested that many of the Native Americans lived where... that is not a real sentence. Let's see. The Native Americans lived in a dynamic relationship with the fires, which ran throughout their territories. It is probable that fires burned over California's landscape for thousands of years and swept through virtually every forest in which there was anything to burn. So again, fires always consistently here, and especially here in the U.S. when we're talking about going into the history that I'm about to go into, it seems like it's this new, like it's out of control, it's too big, it's too crazy.
It's not.
And we'll go against that in a little bit. But first, in terms of just U.S. history, so that was kind of more general of just like how wildfires should work and how they naturally work without human interference. Here in the U.S., Ben Franklin was one of the first people to kind of push this front by establishing a volunteer union fire company, which I think is pretty crazy that this is where we're starting. We're starting all the way back here in Ben Franklin. And then in 1869, we had the first fire tower in Helena, Montana, which was supposed to keep a station out there safe from the fires if it ever got too close. In 1885, the Wildland Fire Control Program was initiated. 1889 brought designated campgrounds and parks for controlled fire spaces, because before that it was, hey, here's this national park that we've made. Go have fun. And then you can light a fire literally anywhere. But now it's, no, you can only
much
do
more
it in
lockdown.
one spot.
Yep.
Yeah, which I think is something that we may not think about nowadays, that was, there wasn't campgrounds. You just went out and enjoyed camping. Not that I'm saying going off trail is bad. I'm just saying going off trail and falling asleep with a campfire is ultimately the worst thing you can do.
Yeah, or going off trail and setting a fire. Yeah, generally not the way to go.
Yes. And then in 1908, the Forest Fires Emergency Act is created. In 1910 is the famous The Big Blow Up. And the Big Blow Up was that huge wildfire that spread from Montana and Wyoming all the way over to Washington. And it just devastated. It was one of the biggest wildfires in the history of the U.S. And it was something that just erupted in millions of acres over a couple of days. And in 1911, we had the controlled fires, was something that we started to use as a nation. And ultimately, we started seeing worldwide as well, where you were able to say, you know what, let's do a controlled burn in this area. And then in 1922, the Timber Protection Act is enacted. 1924, Aldo Leopold has an article of grass, brush, timber, and fire in southern Arizona, which sparks this idea that, you know what, wildfires are an important aspect of our environment, and it needs to be something that we incorporate. And then in 1956 is the first use of water and chemical drops. That's in 1956 is when we start using that.
Wow.
Then in 1967, you have regular prescribed fires. So now you're taking those controlled ones and starting to say, you know what, this forest needs to have it every so amount of years. And there was kind of like, this is where we're going to get into a little bit of not a debate, but more of a discussion later on about whether that's effective or not. And then in 1989, the Bush administration directs Department of Interior to fight all fires, regardless of origin or prescription. So because before that, it was, is this fire really a danger to anybody or not? And now it's saying, nope, you know what? If there's a forest fire and if it gets out of control, quote unquote, whatever that meant in his eyes at that point, it was, let's shut it down and try to get that thing controlled as fast as possible.
Yeah, and that was a pivotal policy that's having impact still today. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one piece that is critical to note on that is that there's two types of fires. So there's the large fires, which just is like a wall of fire that just anything in its path is going to be gone in matters of days, weeks, whatever. It's not going to survive. Whereas there's undergrowth fires that just kind of go right along the undergrowth, creative name, right? But it just goes under the undergrowth and it takes out all of the stuff underneath, and the larger trees are generally untouched. And this is something that is when we're starting to see the US talking about needing to rake the forest, is needing to be able to do basically this, that fire used to naturally do as well. So on top of all of this, I found this interesting reference, and I'm going to see, I'm going to pull it up here. It has, and I got to remember how to do it. I'm going to glitch out for a second as I go, but there's dates of fires. This is, what date is this? Gosh. Nope, not that one. Here we go. So these are the old fires. Oh, shoot. I do block a little bit of it. All right.
It's okay.
Well, as you can see, hey, look, I can even point to it. So what's really interesting about this is this shows how many wildfires there were. So the middle column is how many wildfires have been reported across all 50 states. And then the column that's right where I'm sitting here, this column is talking about how many acres have been burned. And then obviously the year. So there was this weird shift that if you're looking from before there was any colonization in the US, you were seeing upwards of some of these numbers were going all the way up to like 500,000 fires that were happening per year. And the acreage of that can go all the way up to 50 million of it. And so this graph now starts going into, 1952, you see where there's a shift where for the first time, 1952 is the last day. Oh, okay, let me say this. Scrap that. That's not what we're going to put live. The 1953 was the first year that was under 10 million acres that had been burned. Which I find it's kind of a weird, it's like,
that's crazy.
It's great, but it's also like, that seems weird when the numbers that are left on the left of it, which say how many fires are burning, aren't altering. They're not changing. So somehow the amount of acres is getting less and less, but the amount of fires is still going. So I would attribute this to our ability to take them out and saying that we're able to extinguish fires much faster. And so you see this within the 50s and the 60s, that number continuously gets less and less in terms of how many acres are burned, but the amount of fires is still being reported. Now, where it does get weird is that when we get to here in the 70s to the 90s, there is a huge drop. And it's actually right here between 1982 and 1983, where you go from 174,000 fires in 1 year to 18,000 the next year. I was like, what the heck just happened here? You go, why was there a drop? Now, a little bit of history, 1982, 1983 brought the large El Nino, which was actually the worst El Nino in recorded history. That actually reversed trade winds, and you were able to see huge effects of that, both on the West Coast and the East Coast. Really, the entire world was seeing it. But here in the US, it really flipped what was happening. So there's an element that there may have been more moisture in the air that allowed for less fires to start. On top of this, we have been already talking about how there was less trees. We're going to go into that a little bit, but there's less trees because of development and how people are settling west. We're also talking about how our ability to fight fires is getting better at this time. One of the comments here is also fragmentation, which is great. We are going to get into that. And so a level of all of this is there's this huge drop. And now these numbers start going no more than about 100,000 is kind of where we're sitting at how many wildfires are happening per year. And you're seeing upwards of maybe 5 million, but really in the ballpark on average of 2 to 3 million acres being burned every year. Then the third switch. So we've had one, now we had two, and here goes three, which is this one, which goes into current day, which I didn't screenshot this well enough to see all the way up to the top, which is unfortunate. But you see a shift in the 2000s that the number of wildfires isn't changing. It's still consistently staying somewhere in the 50 to 100,000 range. But the amount of acres that are being burned starts having a huge jump, where to the point that in 2015, for the first time since 1953, it's back up above 10 million, which is mind-blowing. And then this happens again in 2017. And so there is this shift of saying, well, the wildfires aren't increasing in terms of number, but the acres that are being burned are increasing. And yet, I would say by 1983, we were pretty well settled in terms of how far we were expanding.
Yep.
We've started to get an idea of how to control these wildfires, right? We've got chemical drops starting in 1956. So why was there this big drop? Now, there are one more note that I wanted to make in this, and I'm going to data pick for a second, which is never a good thing to do. But it helps kind of articulate what the whole trend was, which is that in 1997, there was 2.8 million acres that were burned for 68,000 wildfires. And then in 2015, there were 10.2 million acres for the same 68,000 wildfires. So that difference of 18 years saw a rise of 5-fold acres burned, but same amount of wildfires. And you see that kind of in the general statistics of how all that goes. Oh, sweet. I can switch that. Did not know that. Okay. I'm going to turn off this photo. Go back to nothing. So yeah, that was kind of some of the numbers that we were seeing in a rise. And like I said, there were 3 kind of significant drops that you see happening there. But ultimately, there was another big statistic that was happening here. So when we first started colonizing America, when Europeans started colonizing America, you were seeing roughly, I just lost my number, 950 million 950 million acres of timber. And then going into 1920, 1930 is when the decline basically stops.
Yep.
And you're seeing more about 500 million acres of timber. And that has stayed consistent from that early 1900s till now. So all of those fires that I was just talking about, the numbers in terms of how many fires were breaking out and also how many acres were being burned, is on a consistent amount of timber. Because naturally I would think, well, there was just less fires because there was less trees. But that doesn't seem to show or be backed by this science. And that there was a 30% drop between settlers coming in and this all kind of starting in terms of this data. And that number doesn't seem to be supported either. So that's kind of what I have in terms of the history of what was happening. And I'd love to hear your side in terms of what happened. Why did it happen?
Yeah. So I actually want to just reiterate some of the things that you brought in, and like bring in some more dates, which is that like a lot of the U.S. policy that came out started with the Peshtigo fire in Wisconsin, and it burned 1.2 million acres and killed 1,182 people. And because of this huge fire, there was all this energy to then completely shut down all fires that were created. To bring in another John Muir quote, which is, I'm going to kind of get into why we really misunderstand the whole process, but 1875, he was watching a fire burn in the sequoia forest, and he said that, I'm going to quote directly, the fire came racing up the steep, chaparral-covered slopes, but as soon as the deep forest was reached, the ungovernable flood became calm like a torrent entering a lake, creeping and spreading beneath the trees. There was no longer the danger of being chased and hemmed in. For the main forest belt of the Sierra, fires seldom or never sweep over the trees in broad, all-embracing sheets. So, this is going to be context to how I'm going to talk about how we're mismanaging wildfires. But the fact that this imagery of having this wall of fire and then suddenly it can meet a dense forest with deep undergrowth and be quelled is something that I really wanted to bring in and I thought was really important. Second, you were talking about how in 1935, you see this drop-off in all the fires. And policy-wise, that was based on the 10 a.m. policy, which was this big push of basically if a fire started, it needed to be suppressed and gone by 10 a.m. the next day. And all of these resources went into that. And the problem with that was that we stopped all fires from being able to burn. And so you're creating more of an issue by having all of this undergrowth build up, whereas it wouldn't before. So, to talk more about kind of the effects of all of that and what's going on today, this let burn policy that was more recent of having natural fires be able to burn through and not completely shutting them down, not doing absolute suppression, was a big shift, and one that we haven't necessarily stuck by because there's been a pattern throughout this last 100 years of being able to understand and following what was originally native practices of having fires burn every year, and the benefits of that were clearing out diseased trees, having game actually come, because then when the rains come after the fire, there's all this new growth, and so then game come, they're feeding on the fire, and that was a source of food. Unfortunately, we've wiped out a lot of the game. However, I want to talk about how kind of as a result of all of the things we've done in the past, most of the funding for the Forest Service now is completely based on fighting fires. It's actually 50% of the agency's entire budget is based on fighting them versus preventing them. And obviously, they're incredibly hard to fight. It is a massive fire that even with all the technology that we have today, we still struggle to shut them down. So, I want to talk about kind of why some of that is and really understanding wildfires in a better way. So, first is that wildfire is mostly driven by weather. Today, that has changed because 90% of wildfires today are actually created by humans rather than by natural resources, such as lightning. But
which is crazy.
Yeah, 90%.
I saw that in your notes, and I was just like, 90% is a big number.
90% is a huge number.
Be brought by humans, and then think about if we didn't, what would that 10% really look like?
Yeah. And so, even though 90% of them are created by humans, they're still driven by weather, because obviously they're a natural event. So, big fires are mostly driven by wind and drought, and we'll talk about why that's important. But when there's moisture, only the undergrowth burns. And in the driest parts of the year and little humidity, fires are more likely to burn hot and fast. And the drier and hotter the weather, the greater chance of a high-intensity fire, which, even if you have an old forest, they can't fight as well against. And if you have a high-intensity fire, again, firefighters can't really do anything to stop the blaze. And even if you're digging deep fire lines, if it's hot enough, the blaze can actually just jump the line. And so there's very little we can do once it's burning. In terms of logging, which we kind of talked about, but is something that we've been doing a lot. It's a huge industry, specifically in the United States,
and a lot on the West Coast.
And a lot on the West Coast, especially, which is why there's a lot of fires. And I would say it's definitely contributing to why there's so many fires. So, post-fire logging sets back forest recovery. We have this practice of whenever a fire burns through, we cut down all of the dead trees because we see them as an eyesore, we want to get rid of them. But the problem with that is that it leaves a barren landscape because we want to go in and harvest all that timber. But often when we do that, we also cut down trees that survive in that area, and then we replant. But with replanting, it creates a huge issue in that these new seedlings are not able to fight against forest fire as well. Plus, if we were to just leave that system alone, 1 year after a fire really burns through, everything might look like charcoal. It'll look bad, obviously. But if you wait another year, another 2 years, the natural system will actually happen. And life will begin again. But
life finds a way.
Life finds a way. But when we undercut that system, we disallow life from being able to find a way, and this natural system of fires happening for millennia gets broken. On top of that, logging is really... Roommate's walking upstairs. Gotta fight those stairs. Logging is creating an issue with fires again because it makes them more likely to go up in smoke. Forests with high levels of protection from logging, like wilderness areas, burn a lot less severely because old trees have thick bark and high branches, so they can't burn easily, and it keeps the forest more moist with their branches. And actually, kind of important biology to bring in really quick is that as a tree gets older and older, the outside of it actually just becomes dead cells because that's kind of the way that a tree holds itself up. Like big redwoods have really thick sections of dead cells on the outside because they need that structure in order to get so tall. The other benefit of that structure is that it's hard to burn because it's so thick and old and dense. And so that bark can resist fire. But logging makes it way more likely that these trees can't fight against the fire because they're new, they don't have old bark, and it makes it more likely for them to burn hot because they're also closer together. I mean, obviously, when you're creating a logging industry, you're trying to use as much space as you can, so you're going to pack in as many trees as you can. But the problem with that is that if one tree burns, it's generally touching another tree. And so that tree next to it is just immediately going to light fire, which doesn't happen in the natural system. Huge problem.
I'd like to click pause on you real quick and just note that this isn't us like saying that the timber industry and logging and everything is like this terrible thing.
Not at all.
It has elements that we could account to, but ultimately we're really just trying to say this is an element that is magnifying how much these wildfires are ravaging the land. But yeah, we're not saying that timber should be shut down. That's not what we're trying to say.
Not fighting against the logging industry. It's more just a result of how it's being done. It could be done better. And a really great analogy that I was finding as we were doing all of our research is that tree plantations, are like kindling for a campfire, and natural forests are more like the thick logs that are hard to light. So when you're trying to get your fire going, right, you need a bunch of kindling to get it going. But that really, really thick log is what the natural system is usually like. And that's how you get all the undergrowth burning versus all the trees. And again, not fighting against the logging industry, but just the way that we're using the land could be managed differently, and it would help us fight against fires in a better way. However,
interesting.
Really, it's not only on that, because the larger issue is climate change. But
good. Bring it in.
An important thing to know too is, I think, a misconception is that forest fires don't cause climate change. We think that all the smoke is getting released and it's actually going to make climate change worse. But clouds from the fires are mostly water vapor, and dead trees in the forest release carbon really slowly as they decay, because it gets stored in dead trees, and then as these dead trees slowly decay, all this carbon gets stored in the soil, and then it allows new growth to come, which is why fires are important for natural systems.
Right.
But when a forest fire happens, it only releases 10% of the carbon in the forest during the fire, which is really, really good to know, because cutting down all those trees, when they die, then releases that other 90%, either through burning it. Sometimes it gets stored in long-lasting things like houses. Actually, 30% of forests that are cut down get stored into houses, fences, things that last a while. But
man-made structures.
Man-made structures.
Kind of. Yeah.
But 70% is made into short-term items. So things like food containers, napkins, pencils, things that don't really last that long, or paper. Obviously, all the notebooks that we go through. Things that are also contribute to the 70% is things that are burned or discarded or rot. What happens when we mill trees is that we cut off a lot of the outside bark and obviously the branches, and we only really leave that inside core. But then what often happens is that all the stuff that gets cut out gets turned into wood chips, and that breaks down way more quickly because it's in smaller pieces.
Right.
Which means that the carbon gets released into the system faster.
If you've had to spread bark every year, that is why.
It's true. It's true. So, what I really want to bring in is talking about 2,000 years of Earth's climate. So basically from the year 0 to 2000 today. We aren't going to have the last... Actually, it's up till 2019. So we will have the last decade, which is really important because so much has happened in the last decade. But yeah, Cameron, if you want to pull up the photo.
Yeah, that's this graph here. I'm going to glitch for a second. Oh, maybe not. Oh, dang it. Okay, I'm going to flip it in reverse so you can actually see what you're trying to state.
Sweet. Yeah, so for everybody watching, the left is actually current, and everything on the right is we're going back in time as we move right.
Yeah, if you can see with all the hieroglyphics that are on the top.
Yep. So yeah, the right represents year 0, the left is the year 2019. And blue hues indicate temperatures below the 20th century average. Red colors illustrate years when temperatures were above that level. So obviously, for almost the entirety of the 2,000 years, we have not been in red zones where we're above that level. But drastic heat changes in the last 20, 30, 50 years is what's creating that massive shift in the graph. And
yeah,
go ahead.
Go ahead. Okay. I was going to note on how and I don't know if you were, so I apologize if I'm stealing your thunder here, but the idea that there is the middle age or middle, what was it called? The warm era in the Middle Ages. Yes. I think it's just called the Middle Ages warm period or something like that.
Yeah.
That on an older graph, when it didn't have the last 10 years, like you had said, this is why it's so good that this one did. The middle there, kind of between, kind of right where my hands are, it was red as well. Because the scale that you were looking at, it was so much different. And so it actually showed, red kind of around 1,000. It showed it at 500. It showed it again at like 100. And it was this cyclical, you can see like red, blue, red, blue, red, blue. But when you put it on the scale of today, now automatically this entire thing just turns blue.
Yep.
Which is insane. So
yeah, no, no. That was really important to bring in. Also, for everybody listening on only audio, this is a graph by Ed Hawkins. He's from the University of Reading in the UK. And so if you look up his name and 2,000 years of climate, this was a really big graph that came out. So obviously it'll come up.
It'll also be in our Facebook group if you're not with us on our Facebook group of our podcast Facebook group. Let me clarify. So like our Facebook page, then join our Facebook group, and we can talk more about our podcasts and the different topics in it. But that note, as well as a bunch of other notes that we always kind of add from different episodes, will always be in that group. So check it out.
Yep. Also, on top of the medieval period that you were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
The data at that time is actually based on a regional, not a global scale. So even though that time period was very different as compared to a lot of the time around it, and now it looks so minuscule in comparison to what's happening today, on top of that, it was only happening in a small area versus the entire globe like today.
Yeah. Which is mind-blowing.
Yeah. And to back that up even more, I want to bring in a paper in Nature, which is a really well-respected scientific journal. And they said that we find that the warmest period of the past 2 millennia occurred during the 20th century for more than 98% of the globe. And this provides strong evidence that anthropogenic, which is man-made global warming, is not only unparalleled in terms of absolute temperatures, but also unprecedented in spatial consistency within the context of the past 2,000 years. So these temperatures have never been seen before, and they've never been seen on the global scale that we're seeing right now.
Which is crazy.
Which is absolutely insane.
I'll touch on my points too.
Yeah,
but
we'll get into that more.
To have it jump like that is insane.
And we're talking about wildfires, but climate change is going to be an underpinning of why wildfires are becoming so much worse. And the impacts of that, and I'm really going to step right into kind of our role in this, humans' role in this. But before I go there, I want to talk about how we're seeing those impacts right now. The pine beetle population is at record highs. If you drive around at high elevations, you'll see patches of dead trees. And that's because of this invasive pine beetle that, because of climate change, their mating period has become much larger, and they've also been able to get to higher temperatures. And that's made it so that so many more trees die. It also makes all of those trees much more flammable than they would otherwise. And because we're not allowing natural burns, those beetles don't get wiped out. They're able to just live in these dead trees until they're able to mate again, and then have more trees in their next mating season. And lastly, there's less burning and drier conditions, which means that there's more dry undergrowth. So whereas natural fires would have swept through and with dense forest been able to clear out the undergrowth, have new growth for trees, climate change and the way that we're handling it means that there's more and more dry undergrowth, which really makes a big difference when it comes to the wildfires that we're seeing now.
Yeah.
And for humans' role,
because it keeps going.
And I'll hand it right over to you, but we've completely altered the landscape. And I think this is really important to talk about, not only in how we've managed everything, how we're continuing to do it, and the climate today, but everything in the natural system obviously is connected. It's in flux. And when you take something out, that's going to have impacts. So whereas before there were lots and lots of beavers that created dams, not only did that allow for there to be more wetlands as rivers were able to spread out as a result of all these beavers damming up all these rivers, but those dams also prevented fires from being able to jump. And because there's not as many beavers, there's not as many dams, and so that's creating huge issues. There's also much less game to hunt, or much less game to come and eat the new vegetation that grows in after a fire. And we kind of talked about that. But because of that, and because all this forest is becoming completely, it's becoming more dense, then the undergrowth becomes less diverse and it dies, and then there's, again, more dry undergrowth. Our real impact, and building on to the fact that 90% of our wildfires are from human use right now.
Mm-hmm.
Our
human caused.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Unextinguished campfires, lit cigarette butts, improperly burned debris, and arson are responsible for 80% of wildfires started. And man-made wildfires have tripled the fire season from 46 days to 154 days. And I think that's the biggest thing, is that whereas it used to be a small portion of the year, now it's basically half. And
well, in some places like California are even seeing 2 fire seasons.
Yeah.
Where there's 1 month in between, and then that second fire season may not be as intense, but it lasts quite a while.
Yep. And so really just to lay the point down before I pass it right over to you is that whereas wildfires were once a natural phenomena and they have all these benefits, which they still have today, they're now being recognized as a result of human error and human impacts. Still fired up, no jokes. That was really funny. As a result of handling social media use, I have a limit on the amount of time I'm allowed to be on Instagram, and so my phone just kicked me off. It was like, you're done for the day.
That's awesome.
But that was my last point. And
I think one of the things that you had brought up in terms of like how the fire season is being extended, I had a conversation with somebody about this the other day, and they didn't understand how. So I thought it would be an interesting element to add into here. So one of the things that ultimately, if you don't really fully understand how the seasons kind of all stack on top of each other, you have winter and spring that really brings a lot of moisture. And so you have places, we'll say the forest on the West Coast, that especially here, we get a lot of rain, right? Washington, we're known for it. And so we get all of this rain, and the forest then holds on to this rain for a while. But over time, getting into summer and then going into fall, it starts to lose that moisture. And that's why the fire season seems so late in the summer, even though the summer may start out really hot starting in June. That moisture is still kind of there, and then over time, it goes away. So by climate change and a couple of these other elements that you're talking about, the moisture is not being held in as much.
Yep.
And so earlier and earlier, that moisture threshold is running out. And then by September, it is completely gone, and there is nothing left. It is all dry, dead, dying items. We saw this when we were doing research in the Olympic National Forest. He was talking about how all the moss was just dying in something that's considered a rainforest, and how he wasn't even rained on but once out of the year that we were out there. And so it's this incredible moment of how it's altering at a level that you may not even notice.
Yep.
I was talking about this with somebody the other day too, and how we're kind of in a drought now over on this side of the mountains in Washington, even though it's not as severe as a lot of the rest of the country, and definitely not as much as the rest of the world. I'm still noticing, like, dude, it was hot and there hasn't been that much rain. We've had like 3 or 4 days out of the last month and a half. Which is incredible. But anyways, one of the things that I wanted to talk about in terms of today and its impact and kind of where we're going, I wanted to backtrack to the Australian wildfire, because I think that was a huge element that kind of started this scare of wildfires. And then everyone got concerned about what the US wildfires would look like and where that would go. So the US, or the Australian wildfires, what's critical about that entire thing is the fact that Australia is called the whistle of climate change. And that's because they have already got this extreme polar mixture of where things go. So they're going far, so they get super hot and then they get super cold. But at the same time, they also are all coastline. Yep. They are a huge coal based country. And they've got so many other elements like coral reefs that we don't see in terms of stacking anywhere else in the world. So when we look at Australia, it is this huge signifying aspect of what can go wrong. So the Australian wildfires in total, after it all said and done, destroyed 13.3 million acres of landscape, which is insane to think about.
Yeah.
And the kind of how that happened is this combination of things. So one, their drought had been going for a couple years and it was insanely hot. El Nino is a big portion of this, but mostly it is an arid climate. So it just never really had a wet season. It never came back to being colder and being able to rejuvenate that moisture threshold that I was talking about. Two, their, oh shoot, what was I going to, outtakes, love it, got it.
Outtakes on live.
Yeah, gosh. Outtakes on live, right? Because I accidentally deleted it. So, so they had an insane drought. Then on top of all of this, their system for how they were going to combat fire is mostly volunteer-based. Mm-hmm. So when you incorporate the fact that you have a lot of people that don't necessarily know what they're doing, they kind of got an idea, right? You can have classes and you can be a great volunteer firefighter, but when you're relying on an entire base of volunteers, things can go wrong real fast.
It can.
Yeah, which it's an interesting model, and I don't know much about it, so I apologize if anyone's watching from Australia, but I would be interested to know more about it. So anyways, you have these kind of insane drought, huge average temperature of 107 going into the fire season, which sounds hot, but wait until I get into LA, in the next section here. But yeah, Australia's having an average of 107 degrees. Then they have big winds that are coming across. So the wind is, I don't know if it was abnormal how big it was, but it was definitely the largest that they were having. And so the combination of these two just basically took the fire and just it was out of control quickly. And then as we saw, because it was on all of our social media for months, is that it was never really controlled and you just kind of had to wait.
Yep.
And it took everything with it.
Yep.
There was nothing that really survived. A big portion of it that I don't think was talked about very much is the policies that the country itself was enacting in all of these things. Now, I am going to try to stay away from bad-mouthing anybody because I don't like to do it. And it's going to be a little bit harder when we get to the US. But in terms of the policies of Australia, their prime minister is very anti-climate change, even publicly criticizing people that ever say a word or two about it. And ultimately, he's also gone the opposite direction. Like I said, Australia is built off of coal. So it is hard to kind of go against that when it's your main industry. But at the same time, there are some levels that they agreed to do in terms of Paris Agreement and some other elements that they're totally ignoring.
Yep.
So you have insane just trio of things that could go wrong. Tinderbox, like you've said, that could go wrong, it will go wrong. You have policy that's not in place very well in terms of both how prime minister is running the country and also the fact that the fire department is mostly volunteer. And then on top of all of this, it was Australia. I mean, it was a place that was already prone to be hot, dry, and
arid desert,
and burn fast.
Yep.
So it's an interesting combination when you look at it, and climate change is a huge aspect on all fronts of that it's intensifying everything. But ultimately, I think that it was just in the making. Everything happened, and we were like, it's gotta happen big, and it did. So
it did. Then
in the US, because it gets better, we were like, hey, at least we won't be as bad as Australia, so we thought. And US fires, as of today, because obviously they're still going, as of today, as we're recording this on the 24th, US fires are now in just the West Coast, the 3 states of Washington, Oregon, and California, are up to about 5 million acres.
Wow.
California is seeing 3.4 million acres, Oregon's about 1 million acre, and the US is at 626,000. And some of that has been within days. The US saw about 500,000 of that across 2-3 days.
Wow.
California saw almost 1.5 million in just a day. These fires are just ripping through the landscape. So again, it goes, why? Well, you can talk a little bit generally in terms of what we've already said, but you could also get a little bit more specific. One of them being, let's go California, I think is the best want to talk about, not only because they have the biggest numbers, but because it's the best example of what's happening. Right now, since records have been kept in 1932, the 10 largest wildfires from the state, have been in since 2000. So it's increasing in terms of how big these are getting. And what's crazy is LA hit 121 degrees at the peak of all of this.
Wow.
Right. Yep. And then they even set a potential. It's not verified yet, but at one point, it was Death Valley, I believe, is in there. Is that in California, or is that in Arizona next to it? Whatever it was, that reached 130 degrees, which may be the highest recorded temperature on Earth in terms of kind of recorded history. Repeated myself twice, but there you go.
That is absolutely insane.
Yeah, so they have huge heat. Wildfires are already getting worse as seen since 2000. Drought of El Nino is hitting California hard, as it is hitting that whole belt of the west states. Power lines are having an issue in the area. You've talked about that we're not necessarily clearing the undergrowth in a proper way. There was unusual lightning that happened in one area that lit one fire. And then we obviously have the very, very famous gender reveal party that went wrong. And then there are a couple that were potentially started by arsonists. That is an element of just people being people.
Yes.
But one of the things is that we were seeing like you had said, the efficiency of how fast we could put fires out is actually hurt a place like California, because California hasn't been able to get rid of that debris. So that debris is just stacking.
Yep.
And so when a fire burns through, instead of it getting 1 or 2 or 3 years worth of debris, some places it's hitting 20, 25 years worth of debris. So when it burns, that's supposed to be an undergrowth burn, it's hitting the entire forest all the way up to the top. And those entire trees are going down. And it's California. You got redwoods and sequoias and just these insane giants of plants down there, right? And then Oregon and Washington are seeing kind of mimicry of that same thing. We're seeing a rise in temperatures in terms of our overall climate. Our fire seasons are also getting longer, so on and so forth. And then, like I had teased a little bit earlier, it's not over. California actually has an unofficial second fire season.
Yep.
That starts up here in a month. And that's because the wind that starts coming in picks up fires faster, and it will spread them 3 times faster than they do in the current fire season. So if we thought now was bad, it could get way worse if we can't lock down those fires before that starts. So one of the things that as I was looking at this, I was trying to figure out, how do you put this into perspective? Because when you're talking about these, it seems very it's hard to wrap your mind around. I mean, that's a lot of acreage. And then how is climate change really being incorporated into this? So I came up with an analogy, and I apologize ahead of time because it's not the best thing that I've come up with. And I promise I'll work harder with them in the future. But the one that I had right now, I love campfires. Who doesn't love a good campfire with
everyone loves a good campfire. Right? Yep.
But I am terrible at starting campfires. Like it's not a good consistent. Don't make me start the fire, I guess is what I'm saying. One of the things that if you were to tell me, I'm going to play nature in this role, which I've always wanted to play Mother Nature. But let's say that in this role, I'm Mother Nature, and you've told me I need to go start a fire, and I can only use materials outside, and you're going to give me a cheat of 2 matches. I am going to be able to collect moss, dead twigs, whatever, and bring that all together and say, let's start a fire. But ultimately, my fire is not going to last more than that moss. It's going to be an undergrowth fire. And this is how it was naturally going. This was before man stepped in. It was this just kind of undergrowth fire. There were some big ones, but very rare, right? I mean, the percentage of times I'd be able to do that would be really low.
Very low.
So then you said, hey, you know what? I'm going to help you out a little bit. This is man coming into nature. I'm going to help you out a little bit. I'm going to clear out some of these woods. I'm going to try to fix some stuff up. And it's not going to help out very much. You're going to be able to give me paper. You're going to be able to give me an actual lighter to go stronger on it. The odds of me starting a fire are going to be
way
much
higher
better now.
Yeah.
Way higher. I'm going to be able to just
do the exact
do this
opposite of
time.
what we thought we were doing.
Yeah, so that's all the way up to climate change. So now I have really good odds. I've probably got like a 50, 60% chance of being able to do it. Well, then you're like, hey, well, you know what? Let me help you one more. I've got this guy here that, he's been Boy Scout since he was little. He knows how to start a fire left and right. He's going to set it up for you, and then you can just light it. That was what climate change did to it. So it was somebody who said, I'm going to set this up perfectly, and then we go from there. And I've got this really good quote, and I'm going to start the next one because it's telling me that we've only got a minute left on this live that we're allowed to do. Wow, so right. I'm going to end this live, and then we're going to start up another one right after it. And we're going to continue this. We're almost done anyway. So I'll see you in a second.
And we're back.
All right, and we're back. Sweet. So now we know for the future we can't go longer than an hour. But anyways. This is, so I ended this analogy of talking about how, put on the red lights. Goodness, that's so funny. It's a good call. It's burning now. Now we're getting into it.
Good call. Yeah.
We are, I'm going to be able to light this fire much easier with climate change, because what you've done is you said, now not only am I going to give you great material, I'm going to set it up in a way that all you need to do is literally put a little bit of a spark. Boom, this entire thing will light. And if you really want to go a whole nother level, you could have used it as kerosene instead of having somebody set it up for me. Either way, the point is this thing lights up real fast. So I would argue, now this is an opinion, but I would argue that even if 100% of wildfires were started by arson, they're going to be worse now than they ever were. And that's because you've set it up to be this insane tinderbox. I keep using the same word.
Yeah, I would even put it the other way, is that now even if any of them are created naturally, they're going to be worse than they would have been in the past.
Yeah,
which is
absolutely
tough.
Yeah, I think ultimately it's that not the how they started is not the problem. The problem is what's actually happening within that forest. So I have a quote here from a bioclimatologist named Park Williams. And he says, nature creates the perfect conditions for fire, as long as people are there to start the fires. But then climate change in a few different ways seems to also load the dice towards more fire in the future. So it's this idea that is kind of unfortunate due to the fact that we're not going to actually know this until 15, 20 years down the road, and we can look back and actually look at numbers side by side. Because as we're living this fire season, and we're living the arguments that are happening in 2020, right? I mean, there's tons of arguments that are happening right now from one side to the other. And it's a he said, she said. One of the biggest ones is climate change. And is it real? Is it not? We won't be able to actually show the true signs of this and the true outcome and the true statistics of what happened until down the road looking back. And that's the rough part, is you're trying to fight a battle that is somewhat out there, but at the same time there's like signs of it happening, but it's easy to look away from it. And this is where I think the biggest issue that the US wildfires are facing currently, and Australia wildfires face, and I've already said this, is that it comes down to our policies, and it comes down to our government in terms of what's actually happening, because both of those countries are great examples of putting economics first and all of these things second. I know that you may touch into this a little bit. We talked about this right before we got on the live, but even if we were to set up the entire timber and forest industry around preventing forest fires or being effective in it, the desire to have more money in the economic sector to be able to say, you know what, instead of taking every other tree, it makes more sense and it's easier to just take all the trees.
Take them all. Yep.
You're never actually going to be able to effectively fight fires when we have that mindset. So that policy is what's really important. And I actually pulled, and I'm going to not call out whoever this is, and mostly just because I disagree with the statement that they had, but it was an opinion post on the Washington Post by a Republican elected official. And they said that as they were replying to Oregon's what they claimed a mismanagement of the forest system, which I agree to a degree. I agree to that. And we've talked about this. It hasn't been attacked in a way that it should.
Yeah.
But they were completely blaming it on that instead of on climate change, and saying that the climate change debate that Oregon is saying, because all Washington, Oregon, and California are all blue states. The claim that it was not climate change at all. And it was 100% mismanagement. My monitor popped off here. You've glitched out. I've glitched out. This is a great first live for our podcast. I'm loving it.
Yeah, it's all right.
Here we go. Back in the game. Her quote, I didn't want to misquote her. She said that as a result, Oregon's forests were allowed to become overgrown, and that was creating fire hazards. So her idea is kind of what you were saying in terms of how our management has made trees more put together and it is overgrowing. But at the same time, I don't think that was the fire hazard. No. It isn't section of it. It is a level of like that is what's happening. But when we're talking about the undergrowth fires versus a large scale wildfire that's just going from wall to wall, destroying everything, this is blaming everything onto the fact that we're not managing the forest right, instead of saying, no, a section of that, but we're making the tinderbox. So I would say that a big portion of it, and again, it's 2020, so a lot of stuff is being stirred up. It's an election year, so there's a lot of political moves in terms of saying these things. But I would say the biggest argument that we have, or the biggest thing that is being faced by wildfire, the biggest thing facing wildfires is the political game. And you saw this not only just here,
Absolutely.
But you're seeing it in Australia, and you'll see it over and over in all these other states that continue to just deny that climate change is not even if it's, the major contributor, which we are kind of saying, but saying that it's any contributor to it. And it's this talking that it's going to change how much wind is coming in. It's going to change how hot it's going to be. It's going to change all of the elements you need for a great fire.
Absolutely.
And
we've created a perfect storm
we need to have. Yes, absolutely. So with that, I'll switch it back over to you in terms of what do we expect? What's going to be coming up next in the next couple of years, couple of decades, and ultimately ending it with the good news of what can we do? Potential good news.
Yep. So stick with me here, because unfortunately the answer to that is that it's going to get worse before it gets better. You were talking about how the fires right now have burned 7 million acres. Well, if stats and numbers are anything for you, an average of 72,400 wildfires cleared an average of 7 million acres of U.S. land each year since 2000. So each year, 7 million acres. We've already done 5 million acres in one fire this year.
Yeah.
And if that's not an indicator of how it's going to get worse.
One fire season. It's not one fire
season. Yes. Yeah. In one fire. Yeah. In one fire season. But this has been one of the worst fire seasons on record. And the fire seasons, unfortunately, are only going to get longer. Fires are only going to get more severe. A drier future sets the stage for more wildfires, which is what we are setting the stage for. Climate change has created, again, the perfect storm. And it's predicted to change precipitation and evaporation patterns around the world. It's not only global warming. Global warming is a symptom of climate change, but that means that places that are wet potentially have the potential to get wetter. Places that are dry have the potential to get much, much more dry. And so within the US context, that means places like California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Colorado, Arizona, all of these arid places that enjoy nice weather during the year, but unfortunately with management and with climate change, again, this perfect storm is only going to make fires worse.
Yeah.
So Ben Cook of NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies in New York City, he researches mega droughts, which is basically droughts that extend for decades. More than 3 decades is really like the basic definition. And if greenhouse gas emissions continue to increase at their present rate, if we do nothing at all, the risk of a mega drought in the American Southwest could hit 80% by the end of the century. So that means that we're basically setting ourselves up for something that hasn't happened since the 1910s. And that's something that again, now a mega drought will be much worse than it was in the past.
And your reference of 1910s is the reference to the Dust Bowl and Great Depression, correct? Or
I am. Yeah,
okay,
it is.
Just want to clarify.
Yep. Thank you. Yeah, it is a reference to the Dust Bowl. In addition to Cook, his GISS colleague Kate Marvel, they together were the first to provide evidence that human-generated greenhouse gas emissions were influencing observed drought patterns. And that was as early as the 1900s. So, obviously, it has only progressed. Further quotes from this beautiful man, Cook, who is very knowledgeable on the subject, said that once we change the climatology, we get drier and drier fuels. We should expect more intense fires and higher fire severity. And given how hard it is for us already to fight these fires, unfortunately, the answer to this is that we're just going to have to get used to living with fire.
Yeah. It's a rough.
And the hard part about that is that's the solution, because we need to let natural fires burn in order to clear out a lot of this dry vegetation that has built up over years and years and years. But at the same time, we have to make sure that people aren't losing their homes. And here's the perfect storm that we've created for ourselves, is that we have to fight this natural human response of being afraid of fire, while knowing that we're actually doing something good for the environment by letting it burn. Mark Finney, who has a PhD and works at the U.S. Forest Service's Fire Sciences Lab in Missoula, Montana, said that the fact is every year we're reminded that we don't have a choice, and it's not within our power to keep fire out of our wetlands, or out of our wildlands, excuse me. However, the real choice that isn't often appreciated is our choice of whether or not, or is our choice of what kind of fire we have and when it is. And we have a choice of living with the kind that are sustainable for our ecosystems and communities, or living with the worst ones that burn millions of acres completely out of control and unfortunately put people out of their homes.
Yeah.
So, the history of wildfire suppression over the past 100 years is taking its toll on modern forests, and because they weren't allowed to burn naturally, it's resulting in these massive fuel loads that are capable of creating these really large fires that we're seeing today. Finney also said that when you try to change the appropriate response to fire, such as doing more prescribed burns or not putting the fire out, then the culture tends to react negatively. Obviously, when you hear about a fire or a wildfire on the news, you want it to be put out.
Yeah.
But we have to change how we look at fires, and the science is well developed. The obstacle is using that knowledge in a proactive fashion, and it's almost entirely cultural. So we have to re-understand how fires work in the natural ecosystem and how we interact with them. The problem that we really have... Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and I think it's important to note that, again, this is more on the topic of undergrowth fires instead of these, the losing 1.5 million acres in 2 days of California. That's not what we're saying that we should just get used to. You know, we're talking about needing to get used to the level of saying, you know what, instead of us trying to go through and get the underbrush, it's just let the fire take care of it as it was. One of the quotes that I've said it a million times for CMS in different ways, but I don't know if I've ever said it on a podcast, but it's the idea that the reason climate change is rough is animals have to adapt to their environment, whereas humans adapt the environment to us. And wildfires is one of those instances where we can't adapt the environment to us. And it's also a weird instance where the animals have already adapted. They've moved on. They're ready. And so whatever we throw at them, they're going to continue to be able to adapt and shift and move with. Whereas here, we can't adapt to this in terms of trying to control it. We have to be alongside the animals and say, okay, let's just embrace what's happening and be able to work around it. And that's what you're ultimately suggesting in terms of how we have to move forward to some degree.
Yeah, and ultimately it's a tough solution because people have spread out more and more into the forests. And so the tough thing is that that's a risk that you kind of have to accept at this point in time, that if you're moving out into the wild forest, this is such a tough thing to say as someone who cares so much about the environment, and I would so love to just have a cabin in the woods one day. But this conjunction, this balance of having the natural ecosystem be able to do what it should be able to do while still trying to protect the people that live in those places is something we have to figure out.
Yeah.
And what's great is that there's so much science and research going into not only understanding how fires burn, but how to actually better prevent them so that we're not doing complete fire suppression and keeping things from burning, but we're keeping them relatively controlled. And again, wildfires aren't something that humans can really control. We're going to have to accept that.
Yep.
But the real step, which I wanted to bring it back to, is that at this point, it's about policy. And so in terms of talking what we can do, I want to kind of give a few individual steps of what you can do to keep from starting a wildfire. And that means burning debris around your home if you want to protect your home. But when you're doing that, they recommend doing it in a 50-gallon barrel away from everything else and keeping your piles really small. When you put out a fire, the little what's used by Smokey Bear, not Smokey the Bear, Smokey Bear, is drown, stir, drown, feel. And so you should be drowning your fire, stirring everything around so that the heat can get out, and then drowning it again, and you should be able to feel that your fire is out. If you can't put your hand relatively close to the fire that you just put out, it's not out and you are not done. And you should not leave that there.
And that's if you want to burn your debris instead of if you're going to just remove it, just leave it in the forest somewhere and let those nutrients go right back into nature as well. Let it decompose, whether in a pile or scattered around, somewhere.
Yep.
I'd argue to go that first, and then if you want to burn it, then burn it.
Yep. And when you're camping, obviously these are things that get told to you by the Park Service, but only start a fire in an appropriate pit. Only do it where they say that you can. Not only because when it's not a designated pit that's cleared of vegetation and ringed by stones, that pit has also been used over and over again, and that area, the 6 feet below that, has already been burned. But the issue with when you set up a new campfire, and what's really unfortunate, and I don't know if it's necessarily well known, is that when you light a fire in a new place, it kills the life up to 6 feet below in the soil. And that basically wipes out any possible growth that could happen. Because seeds sit in the soil and they wait for the right conditions, right? They wait for enough water and enough nutrients to begin germination and come out of the ground, right? But when you start a fire on top of them, it kills all those seeds. And whether or not the conditions are right, growth can no longer happen in that place for a really, really long time until everything is kind of able to fill in that space again. So only light your fires in designated campfire sites, not only because it's better to prevent wildfires, but also because it protects the nature.
Embodying some Smokey Bear there. I love it.
Love Smokey Bear. Couple more tips, and then really we want to tie it off with how you can use really your vote. But if you're smoking, you need to dispose of them in the right way. That either means a closed container or a cup of water. And obviously pay attention to fire safety ordinances. If it says that it's a high case of fire, don't have a fire. And you know what? It's nice to have a campfire when you're camping, but if it's high risk, it's absolutely not worth it. And if you're going to be going out and enjoying nature, that's part of the thing that you have to accept, is that there are rules, even in this natural environment, that you're trying to go enjoy. Yeah. But at the end of the day, large-scale problems like this rely on policy. We went through the history of how policy has influenced the last 100 years of forest management. And it's going to influence the next 100 years. And this is a problem of climate change management at this point, and fire management, and forest management. And so putting the right officials in place that are believing in climate change, believing in the fact that we need to reform this system, is going to be really, really important. So this is our little political plug of go talk to your representatives, vote for people that support and believe in climate change, and understand that this is a pivotal point in history. And if we don't really put the right energy into our future, then it's going to be a harder future for us all to coexist in.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's important, voting both locally and nationally. And if we have anyone who's going to be watching this from international waters, then follow all of your systems as well. And
absolutely.
One of the things we had mentioned that you can do if you are in an area that has volunteer services, maybe that's something that would be interesting to you as well. And you can actually be fighting wildfires right on the forefront there as well. So those are a couple things. And I think ultimately it's get educated. Obviously, we've just had a long discussion about
extensive
wildfires.
Discussion.
And it's talked about both history and how it's changed and so on and so forth. But there is a level of we're not anywhere near the surface of what more can be learned. So one resource that I really wanted to plug that I think shows signs that people don't talk about as much is this thing called thrivingwithfire.org. And it has this animated owl called Dottie the Owl. And she is kind of like a Smokey the Bear type icon, I guess you can say, but just not as lifted up as much. And I would check that out. They have a couple videos. They have 6 videos, I believe, and a couple other resources on there in terms of what wildfires really do and how they impact. And a lot of our information was really from them as well. So check that out. And like you said, follow guidelines and be safe in those senses.
Absolutely.
But
yeah.
What's next, Logan? What's our next pod?
I thought we weren't talking about what our next pod was.
Oh, I'm going to talk about it because I would love to talk about it. You just tease it.
Well, we are going to be doing a controversial conservation. I have to say that slowly because it's always hard to say. Love our name, but hard to get out. And we're going to be talking about single use. Is this correct?
Yeah, it wasn't. I don't think it was controversial though. It was our platypus episode.
Oh, you're right.
Look, another blooper for everybody. Awesome.
Another blooper for everybody on live. All right. We're going to be talking about... Wow. Big bloopers on the outro every time. This is the view into the void.
Oh my gosh. If people saw... I'm glad you guys are seeing this here. If you guys saw how much tape I have for our outros, it's the worst. Outros and intros are the hardest parts.
Outros and intros are the worst. Yeah, so we're going to be doing a platypus on combating management.
I mean, it's a section of it. It's just one-time use items.
Oh my gosh. Yo, I'm forgetting we already also plug into live. We already recorded this. I'm like, yo, what is our next one that we have planned for? Cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, we've already recorded this one.
Our next platypus is going to be talking about single use items and how we can honestly handle them better. How we can move forward into the future in a way that doesn't have this single-use culture and change our way of life for the betterment of the environment.